Today, a conclave of the College of Cardinals is meeting in the Sistine Chapel in the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican to elect from among their own number a new pope, a new Bishop of Rome. This method for electing the Pope is a relatively recent procedure in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. Prior to the 13th century, the idea of a papal conclave was entirely unknown. Indeed, before the 11th century, the College of Cardinals didn't exist as a formal body as it does today. The cardinals were not the primary electors. In this video, I want to talk about the history of papal elections and how the Pope came to be elected in this rather unique way. I will need to do this in reasonably broad terms, looking at the major moments of change, as in truth you could write a lengthy book about this subject. Much of the history of papal elections, particularly in the politically fractious Middle Ages, was bound up with power politics. It was chaotic and turbulent, and at times papal conclaves were truly farcical affairs. As time went on and chaos and dysfunction gradually disappeared, order developed, and at the end of the video I will go on to talk about the very measured and regulated electoral process used today, and I will try to give you some impression of what is going on in the conclave behind the closed doors of the Sistine Chapel. So let's start at the very beginning in the Apostolic Age. And for the first 3 centuries of the existence of the Church in Rome, we don't really know how the bishops were appointed. There was no formal mechanism, as far as we can tell, for election, and it is likely that candidates for the bishopric were chosen by the clergy and laity and confirmed by public acclamation. For much of the first 1300 years of the Church's life, the only qualification for being Bishop of Rome, or indeed Bishop of anywhere, was to be a member of the Church. Sometimes even catechumens, those still preparing to be baptized, could be chosen. Many of the earliest popes were elected from among the deacons, rather than the presbyters, the priests of the Church. The deacons were those who ran the outreach of the Roman Church on behalf of the bishop himself, and therefore had lots of useful practical experience. When in 313 AD, under the Emperor Constantine, Christianity became a tolerated religion, and then in 380 AD, under the Emperor Theodosius, became the state religion of the Roman Empire, the dynamics of power naturally shifted. Although the bishops of Rome were still in theory elected by the clergy and people of Rome, successive emperors often manipulated papal elections, and they established the power to confirm those elections before they became official. Almost as soon as Christianity was confirmed as the official religion of empire, so the emperors moved their focus from Rome to the new city of Constantinople on the Bosphorus to the east. A century later, in the 5th century, the western part of the Roman Empire fell to the barbarian hordes from the north. The Italian peninsula became politically unstable, and the Pope was often the most stable figure in the region, both religiously and politically, and in the absence of the emperor, he became a major power broker. It was inevitable, with the Bishop of Rome occupying such a political office, that the succession to the papacy would be contested and elections would be interfered in by other political actors. The Byzantine emperor still continued to press his right of veto over the appointment until the year 684, but it was increasingly nominal. In the early 6th century, the de facto rulers of the region, including the Arian Ostrogothic kings, also claimed that right too. Both Ostrogothic and Byzantine influence was swept away by the rise of the Lombards in the mid-6th century, and this caused considerable disruption to the papacy. Popes then turned to the west and to the Franks and to the Merovingian kings for support, though it appears that there was little initial involvement by Frankish kings in papal elections. The Merovingian dynasty was in turn replaced by the Carolingian emperors, and in the early 9th century they directly claimed the right to confirm papal elections. In 824, in a document called Constitutio Romana, the Carolingian Frankish co-emperors Louis the Pious and his son Lothair I made a deal with Pope Eugene II. In return for Frankish military support, Pope Eugene agreed that after the election popes were only to be confirmed in office following the assent of the Carolingian emperors. Of course, the Carolingian Empire soon fell to pieces and so their influence waned. The early years of the 10th century are often known as the Saeculum Obscurum, the obscure century, a low point in papal history. With a power vacuum in Europe, control of the papacy fell into the hands of patrician Roman families. Although still nominally elected, popes were very often appointed or controlled by noble factions within the city. With the revival of a Western Empire in Europe under Otto I of Saxony in the 960s, the papacy would escape the clutches of Roman factionalism. Otto agreed to act as protector of the Pope, but with a price, and through a document called Privilegium Ottonianum, like the Carolingians before him, he did so on the proviso that he could confirm or veto papal elections. From the middle of the 11th century, a strong reformist movement developed within the Catholic Church. The Church was rife with corruption, particularly afflicted by simony, the purchasing of offices within the Church by secular rulers. The beginning of the present electoral system can really be traced back to this reform movement, notably to a papal bull of 1059 promulgated by Pope Nicholas II, entitled In Nomine Domini, in the name of the Lord. This bull set out to do two things. Firstly, it attempted to regulise the makeup of the electoral body, and secondly, to limit the veto of papal elections by secular authority. It is in this bull that the election of the Pope is taken away from the wider clergy and laity and is put into the hands of the cardinals. In 1059, the College of Cardinals was not a collection of grand princes of the Church, as it became in the Renaissance, nor was it the large international body of clergy it is now. In the 11th century, the cardinals of the Roman Church were the senior clergy who ministered in and around Rome. Just as there are today, there were three ranks of them, and each rank corresponded to a particular role in ministry. The top rank were the cardinal bishops. They were the 7 bishops of the suburbicarian sees, the bishops who ministered to the church in the Roman suburbs. Then there were the cardinal priests, who numbered around 10 or so in the 11th century. These were the men who, with delegated authority, oversaw the work of the major churches within the Diocese of Rome. Then there were 7 cardinal deacons. These were clerics who were members of the papal household and managed the government of Rome, which at various points in the past 2,000 years has been the Pope's responsibility. The word cardinal is derived from the Latin word cardo, which means a hinge or a pivot point on which something is able to turn and move. And the cardinals of the Roman Church gained that nickname, if you like, because they were the pivot point. They helped the Bishop of Rome connect and to be able to act and move within his church. In other words, they were his eyes and ears. These 3 ranks of cardinals still remain in the church today, although their role is quite different. They are the Pope's eyes and ears, not just in Rome, but across the world. The different ranks of cardinal were given different tasks in 1059. It was the cardinal bishops, who as the Pope's direct episcopal colleagues, who were given the primary responsibility of choosing a suitable candidate for the position from the Roman clergy. That candidate would then be presented to the other ranks of cardinals in Rome for ratification. After election, the lesser clergy and the laity of Rome were still given the role of acclaiming, or not, the cardinal's choice of bishop. The second purpose of the 1059 bull was to limit the influence of the secular rulers on papal elections. The Holy Roman Emperors were allowed to confirm the elector's choice, but not to interfere in the choice of a particular candidate or to overturn the election itself. For a couple of centuries, this system persisted, but at times it creaked around the edges. In 1179, at the Third Lateran Council, it was established that a 2/3 majority of the cardinals were required to elect a candidate. It was permissible for a candidate, if they were personally present, to vote for themselves, and with such a small electoral body, there were never more than 20 to 30 cardinals at this point in history, such a vote would be crucial. Although the power to confirm or veto elections had been banned since 1059, that didn't stop secular rulers trying to influence elections, either through bribery or force of arms. In 1241, an attempt to influence a papal election directly would result in further change. When Pope Gregory IX died, the papacy was in the midst of a very long dispute with Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Frederick had surrounded Rome with his army. Indeed, the whole of Rome, including all the cardinals, were divided into two parties: the Guelphs, who were supporters of total papal independence, and the Ghibellines, who supported closer ties with the empire. The election of the new pope took place in this volatile atmosphere, surrounded by Frederick's army. It was held a little out of town at the mostly ruinous Roman complex called the Septizodium, near the Clevis Scoury. There were then only 14 cardinals, and some were out of Rome and were prevented from entering the city by the emperor. In the end, only 10 cardinals voted in the election. For the last 2 weeks of the conclave, with no clear candidate emerging, the Roman senator Matteo Orsini locked the cardinals in. The cardinals eventually elected Pope Celestine IV, who appears to have caught dysentery due to the poor conditions during the election and died 14 days later. The cardinals all then fled Rome, and the Emperor Frederick took control of the city, and the See of Rome would remain vacant for over 2 years. It had been the policy of popes from the late 11th century to appoint non-Italian cardinals. This was a policy designed to create stability and to free elections from the influence of Italian politics. Sadly, the appointment of French and German cardinals simply led to an increase in factionalism, which had the unintended consequence of prolonging many papal elections. In November of 1268, Pope Clement IV died at the papal palace of Viterbo, and the cardinals were called to duly elect his successor. There was still within the College of Cardinals the ongoing rivalry between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, but an extra layer of tension was now present, a rivalry between French and Italian cardinals. For the next, nearly 3 years, the Church was without a pope, as these various factions sat in Viterbo, battled against each other, and failed to reach a compromise on a suitable papal candidate. The 20 cardinal electors were divided nearly equally between the French and Italian factions, with the sub-factions within each of these. After months of deadlock, the roof of the palace in Viterbo was removed to hasten things along, and it is alleged that Charles of Anjou, the King of Sicily, put the cardinals on near-starvation rations. That concentrated the minds somewhat, and eventually Charles persuaded the cardinals to delegate their decision-making to a committee of 6, and in September of 1271 they chose Teobaldo Visconti, a non-cardinal who was then off on crusade, to become Pope Gregory X. After the fiascos of 1241 and 1268-71, it was clear that further reform of the electoral process was necessary, or else the Church would be blighted by repeated periods of vacancy in the Holy See. In July of 1274, 3 years into his pontificate, Pope Gregory X called the Second Council of Lyon to do just that, and he issued a papal bull entitled Ubi Periculum, which means where there is danger, and it established a series of rules for papal elections that would prevent drawn-out and deadlocked elections becoming the norm. Firstly, it instructed that all the major offices of the Church should immediately cease their functions when a pope died, thus creating a period of stasis in the Church that prevented ordinary business taking place. Secondly, it was ordered that the election should be held in the place where the previous pope died, or in the nearest city in the diocese, and that it should begin 10 days after the pope's death, which gave time for the cardinals to gather. There was a clause that prevented cardinals from voting in absentia, which was a source of corruption, or from leaving the election until it was concluded, except in the case of illness. And this was the difficult bit. The cardinals were expected to live together in common in a single room without privacy. and they were to be carefully guarded and locked. They were forbidden from engaging in any outside politics or other work or involving themselves in bribery. If a pope had not been elected after 3 days, the cardinals were then put on rations, and they were permitted only one dish at each of their meals. But after 8 days, they were to be fed only on bread, wine and water. And the enforcement of all these rules was put in the hands of outsiders, the rulers and officials of the particular city in which the election was taking place. It is due to ubi periculum and its insistence that the election must take place behind locked doors that the gathering of cardinals for a papal election has become known as a papal conclave, a word in Latin that means in essence with key. The cardinals were kept behind lock and key until a decision was made. The provisions within ubi periculum were given a mighty test in the extraordinary year of 1276, when there were in fact 3 papal elections. Despite the continuing factionalism, both Innocent V and Adrian V were both elected under the new regime within 10 days, and the process was therefore shown to work. However, Adrian V, during his brief pontificate, he was pope for only 5 weeks, overturned ubi periculum without putting in place new legislation. And so for the final election of 1276 through to the election of 1292 to 1294, there was a return to the long and chaotic elections of previous years. The papal election of 1292 to 1294 lasted for 2.5 years. And the result was the election of a non-cardinal, a Benedictine monk who took the name Pope Celestine V. After being elected, very much against his will, it must be pointed out, in September of 1294, Celestine V re-established ubi periculum, and then 4 months later he resigned. Subsequent popes over the next decade reiterated the force of ubi periculum, with Pope Boniface VIII enshrining it in the canon law of the Church. Although ubi periculum dealt with the length of papal conclaves, it didn't deal with the factionalism that existed among the cardinals, and that problem came to a head in 1305. In that year at Perugia, 15 cardinals elected a Frenchman and non-cardinal, Archbishop of Bordeaux Raymond Bertrand de Goat, as Clement V to succeed Benedict XI. He was, of course, in France, and was in no rush to head to Rome, which at that time was locked in a civil war between 2 major families, the Colonna and the Orsini. Crowned as Pope at Bordeaux, he simply remained in France, and eventually the papal court settled at Avignon. One of Clement's acts during his pontificate was the calling of the Council of Vienne in 1311, and during that he reimposed the terms of ubi periculum. The story of the Avignon papacy, the power vacuum that it caused in Rome and the descent into the Western Schism and the eventual return of the papacy to Rome in the early 15th century will have to wait for another video. The College of Cardinals gradually grew in size from the 15th century, and as this occurred, so the need for further reform became more apparent. Despite the prohibition on simony from previous centuries, the practice of lay people buying cardinals' votes in a papal conclave was rife. Julius II in 1505 put in legislation to ban simony. It became an offence punishable by excommunication. In 1621 further reforms came in the form of the bull of Gregory XV, Aeterni Patris Filius. It was he who introduced the system of cardinals voting in a secret ballot, which further reduced external influence on the outcome of a conclave. He also banned cardinals campaigning. He enshrined too the requirement for a 2/3 majority among the cardinals, and he banned at this stage cardinals voting for themselves. Strict rules for the scrutiny of the ballots were established that still continue. As a means of preventing electoral deadlock, it was now possible for a small committee to be elected to choose a candidate, and if that failed, Gregory even put in place provision for the election of a pope by the ancient method of acclamation by the people, though that has never been put to the test. Those who wished to influence the result of papal elections had to use more subtle methods than buying cardinals directly in the period after 1505. The kings of France, Spain and the Holy Roman and later Austrian emperors all claimed a right to involvement in the process, which they termed jus exclusive, the right of exclusion, the right to veto certain candidates from the election. This right was used very subtly. The secular ruler would confide in a cardinal that he disapproved of a certain candidate, and the cardinal would be compelled to reveal that to the rest of the conclave. And there was an expectation then that the candidate would proceed no further. No money officially changed hands, so the cardinal could not be accused of simony. It is believed that one or other of these various monarchs fixed the outcome of 11 papal elections between 1644 and 1903. In an apostolic constitution called Commissum Nobis, promulgated in 1904, Pope Pius X, who had been elected in 1903, banned the practice under pain of excommunication. As we have seen in the distant past, papal conclaves were held in a variety of locations. The Apostolic Palace in the Vatican only became the primary location for them in the 15th century, following the return of the papacy to Rome from Avignon. The Lateran Palace, hitherto the main metropolitan palace of the popes and the location of many earlier conclaves, was in disrepair, and the Vatican became the primary papal residence. There was no particular rule as to where in the papal palace the conclave should take place. In Viterbo, in the 13th century, it took place in the main hall. The Sistine Chapel, which is the main chapel of the papal court, has only been the scene of conclaves since 1492, when Rodrigo Borgia was elected as Pope Alexander VI. The chapel was, of course, only constructed in the 1480s, and it is likely that earlier conclaves in the 15th century took place in the chapel's predecessor, the Great Chapel of the Papal Household. Since 1492, the Sistine Chapel has been the usual venue for the conclave, but not always. The 1549-50 conclave was held in the Pauline Chapel in the Apostolic Palace, as the Sistine Chapel had been divided into cells to accommodate the infirm cardinals present at that conclave. The 1559 conclave, that ran from September to December of that year, took place in various locations in the Apostolic Palace, including the Pauline as well as the Sistine Chapel. During the early years of the 19th century, a number of conclaves were held outside the Vatican. The conclave of 1799 to 1800 took place against the turbulent backdrop of Napoleon's invasion of Italy. The cardinals had been expelled by him from Rome, and the conclave had to be held at the San Giorgio Monastery in Venice. Then, from 1823 to 1846, during a period of considerable instability in Italy, the conclaves all took place in the Pauline Chapel, the primary chapel in the Pope's main Roman residence, the Quirinal Palace. In 1870, the Pope was kicked out of the Quirinal and lost the Papal States, and the papacy returned to the Vatican, and every conclave since has been held in the Sistine Chapel. Which brings us right up to the 20th century. Until the late 20th century, the regulations of Aeterni Patris Filius from 1621 governed papal conclaves, although they were slightly tweaked. In 1945, for example, Pius XII removed the ban on cardinals voting for themselves. Since the 1970s, as with much that governs the Catholic Church and its life, there has been considerable reform and also codification. In 1996, Pope John Paul II, in an apostolic constitution entitled Universi Dominici Gregis, imposed a set of reforms that govern papal elections today. One of the aspects that had to be dealt with in recent years is the size of the College of Cardinals. In the 12th century, the body numbered around 20 individuals. By the early modern period, this had grown to around 50 or 60. It remained fairly static at that level until the second half of the 20th century, when the number first grew to around 200. In 2025, there are 252 cardinals. As all cardinals had a right to vote, the size of the conclave got bigger and bigger. There were 80 cardinals in the 1963 conclave, and it looked likely to grow further. So in 1975, Pope Paul VI capped the number of participants at 120. There were 111 cardinals at both conclaves in 1978. In 1996, in Universi Dominici Gregis, a new rule was introduced that aimed at capping the number of electors. In future, only cardinals under the age of 80 would be eligible to vote. Currently, there are 135 cardinals under the age of 80, and therefore, in theory at least, all are eligible to vote. And as there's no mechanism to exclude any and keep to that 120 cap, I believe 133 cardinals are now in conclave. It is the largest and of course the most diverse conclave in history, the cardinals drawn from many different nations, which makes it difficult to second guess a result. Since the 13th century, as we saw earlier in the video, the cardinals have all been required to live a communal life during the conclave. That meant in practice in recent centuries that they had to sleep in the Apostolic Palace. That wasn't too bad when there were fewer cardinals, but it caused problems in the larger conclaves of the 1960s and 70s. In 1996, therefore, John Paul II constructed a special guest house for them to live in called the Casa Santa Marta, and since Universi Dominici Gregis, they have been required to live there during the conclave. This still allows them to live that common life, but with a little more comfort. On the day of the conclave itself, the cardinals first gather in St. Peter's Basilica to concelebrate a Mass, with the Dean of the College of Cardinals acting as principal concelebrant, and in which they pray for the guidance of the Holy Spirit during the coming conclave. In the afternoon, they then proceed to the Sistine Chapel. The Papal Master of Ceremonies and the Secretary of the conclave are the only two people who remain in the chapel with the cardinals during the process. After preliminary prayers and an address, the conclave begins with the Master of Ceremonies clearing the chapel. He says, "Extra omnis, everyone out," before closing and bolting the chapel doors. The cardinals then take an oath together to maintain the secrecy of the conclave, and then one by one they come up to make an individual oath, which they swear on the Book of the Gospels. They swear to keep the prescriptions contained in Universi Dominici Gregis, to maintain the secrecy, and if they're elected, to faithfully carry out the Petrine ministry, i.e. the ministry of the Pope as the successor of St. Peter. Before 1978, the cardinals would be seated arranged around the walls of the Sistine Chapel, each seat placed under a canopy of honour, showing that they were each of equal status. When one of their number was then elected Pope, all but his canopy would then be removed. Now they are seated at desks in double rows to accommodate their great number. Once seated, the first ballot begins. Each cardinal is given a ballot paper on which they write their preferred candidate's name, and which they then fold. Then, in order of precedence, they go one by one to their chapel's altar. They hold their ballot papers aloft so that they're visible to all, while saying, "I call as my witness Christ the Lord, who will be my judge, that my vote is given to the one whom I believe should be elected according to God." On the table is a special vessel with a pattern on top of it. Traditionally, in times past, when there were fewer cardinals, a Eucharistic chalice and pattern were used for this purpose. The cardinal places his ballot on the pattern and then uses it to drop it into the vessel. He then bows to the altar and returns to his seat. At the table are 3 scrutineers who are randomly chosen from among the cardinals. And after all the votes have been cast, one of the scrutineers shakes the chalice to mix the ballots. Another then counts them one by one, transferring them into a second empty container. If the number of ballots doesn't match the number of electors, all ballots are burned and a new vote is held immediately. If the count is correct, the ballots are then open and read one by one. As the votes are read and tallied, the third scrutineer pierces each ballot with a needle and threads them together like a string, after which the scrutineer's work is then scrutinised by 3 cardinal revisers, again chosen at random. Universi Dominici Gregis is the primary document governing how the electoral threshold operates. Like previous legislation, it has a clause designed to ensure that conclaves don't end in stalemate and the roof doesn't need to be taken off or the cardinals put on rations. For the first 33 ballots, a pope can only be elected by a 2/3 majority of the cardinals. After that, the cardinals can set a different threshold, but a candidate must have an absolute majority of votes. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI altered this very slightly. If no candidate achieves a 2/3 majority after 33 ballots, a runoff election between the two leading candidates can then be held, but the elected Pope must still secure a 2/3 majority. Apart from the first day of the conclave, when there's just a single ballot, there are 2 ballots every morning and 2 every evening until a Pope is elected. One of the very visually appealing tradition of the white and black smoke used today to signify the success or the failure of a vote in a conclave. Well, after each ballot, the ballot papers on their strings are routinely burned so they can't be tampered with. The Sistine Chapel has no chimney, and it seems that a temporary stove has been installed in it when conclaves have been held there since the 18th century. It seems that when the papacy moved back to the Apostolic Palace in 1870, that crowds in St. Peter's Square during subsequent conclaves began to notice the smoke rising from this temporary stovepipe and to attach some meaning to the varying colours of it. With the popular tradition having already emerged from the 1914 conclave onwards, attempts were made to make white and black smoke to please the crowds. Wet straw for white and pitch for black produced the requisite billows of smoke. Since 2005, to ensure consistency, this has been replaced with chemical smoke bombs. After election, the Dean of the College of Cardinals approaches the newly elected Pope and asks him if he accepts his canonical election. If he says yes, the Dean then confirms the name he will be known by. It has long been traditional for popes to take a pontifical name that is different to their baptismal name. If the Pope isn't already a bishop, and a few of the cardinals present at this conclave this year are not, he is then immediately consecrated a bishop by the Dean. The new Pope then goes into a small room or sacristy to the left of the altar of the Sistine Chapel. This little room has become known as the Room of Tears, as many popes have broken down in tears in here at their election. And it's here that the Pope dons the papal white cassock and other emblems of his office. He then returns to the chapel, where he is seated on a chair before the altar, and the camerlengo of the Roman Church then places on his finger the fisherman's ring, and at this point the new Pope receives the authority of the Apostolic See. The cardinals then, in order of precedence, pay their homage to the new pontiff. The Papal Conclave is a unique electoral process, and as I hope I've demonstrated in this video, its development is a fascinating and complex story which cannot be divorced from and has long been affected by the turbulence of wider contemporary society. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.